such an easy accommodation with each other because there's so much common ground there. And it struck me that the journey that I'd taken as a Scottish writer, a writer who identified as Scottish and who wrote in the modern Scots tongue and wrote about Scottish people, why I'd made that decision. And I look back in some of the great iconic artworks of, say, the last 30 or 40 years that have really touched Scots and have lasting value. So, The Cheviot, the Stag and the Black Black Oil by John McGrath, the 1973 play, something like The Steamy, something like Black Watch, something like Train Spotting, for example. All of these have something in common. They are told using Scots voices. They speak to the national question to different degrees, and they're about class. The national question and the class question are inextricable at the moment in Scotland, and will be until Scotland becomes independent. And once Scotland becomes independent, the true nature of the struggle will be revealed. Because the SNP, I think, pretty much, after a yes vote, would dissolve. The membership would start to say, okay, well, we're here. This was the mechanism I choose to support in order to achieve independence. Now independence has been achieved. Am I a capitalist or a socialist? And I think the majority of people who are involved in the yes movement will break towards socialism, and that's when this will become the sort of national mass movement that replaces the current SNP. Unfortunately, we're locked in a holding position at the moment. We're in stasis. We're between referenda, essentially, which is where we get our shit together. That's what this is all about today. So there was a lot of chat this morning about what have we learned from the independence referendum campaign. What mistakes did we make? What did we get right? And I disagreed with some of the comments which people were making that analysis hasn't been done. We're not talking about that enough. We're just blindly ignoring the flaws in the initial argument. I don't think that's the case. I think that's all we've been talking about since then. Because of course we have. We have to cogitate on why we lost the referendum. And one of the things I think that hasn't been talked about quite as much is what we actually achieved. Because if you look at the conditions in Scotland now and what they were 3 years ago, they're completely different. The media landscape has been completely transformed by the new media. Websites that people way beyond this room, people who were never political geeks, sorry, no offence, people, but you know what I mean, people who are already politicised. Your working person started reading websites like Wings Over Scotland, Bella Caledonia, now Common Space, people who have been politicised in the last 3 years. So our media diet has completely changed. We've got a weekly newspaper devoted to independence. We've got a daily newspaper. We now take these things for granted. That's a massive change. The vote went from 30% to 45%. That in itself is enormous. We forget to actually recognise the scale of that achievement because we might have lost the vote, but we won the argument. And we won the argument because they started from a base of 70% support and it went down to 55%. And that can't happen if their argument was stronger than ours. They would have increased support. They didn't. Nonetheless, they did win the vote. So where are we? I think there's a great deal of nationalist sentiment in Scotland at the moment, which is actually positive and benign and can and has been successfully harnessed by the left. The difference between Scottish nationalism and British nationalism is vast, because the right won the argument in British nationalism and the left won the argument in Scottish nationalism. So I don't think we necessarily have to be too afraid of the current nature of Scottish nationalism. While always keeping our eyes open, obviously, the ethnic debate doesn't really exist. Nobody in Scotland and the independence movement gives any attention to anybody who makes that line of argument. It's a nonsense. The cultural argument, I think, however, is strong. And that's what Robin was talking about earlier. I'll give you a wee example, right? I'm going to cross the line now. I'm going to break the omerta and talk about Braveheart. Because we weren't allowed to talk about Braveheart for the 3 years. I can see every now, right, okay, where's this going? All right, this better be good. I went back and watched it recently. Went back and watched it with my mum, actually, who would probably always have described herself as a patriot, never as a nationalist and never as a socialist. And go back and do it. This will be your experience of watching Braveheart, right? For 3/4 of the way through it, you're like, this is a fucking lot of shit. This is Hollywood nonsense. And there is a lot to argue against it. It's very macho, it's very male. glorifies conflict. It's made by Mel Gibson. You know what I mean? No, a progressive. But let's look at what Braveheart is actually about. First of all, Scots were visible themselves on the cinema screen that they could go to in their local multiplex and see a story about themselves. That is massive. The change that engendered in a population is huge. And what was that story? That was a story of a common person, a common Scot who had nothing, rising up against his oppressor and taking the people with him. Now, it gets written off as an anti-English story. Now, it's clear who's pulling the strings in that particular narrative, but it's also against the Scottish ruling class. The Scottish ruling class who, for land and glory and titles and honour, sold out their own people. And that speaks to the Scots very powerfully. The national question and the class question are inextricable in that narrative, and that's why it exploded the way it did. And that's why train spotting exploded the way it did. So I think what I'm saying there is I think we're going in the right direction. And there is a wee bit of friction just now, probably everybody's noticed it, between the radical left and the SNP in advance of the Holyrood elections, because everybody's trying to win votes. I think those tensions will probably ease after May, and I think, oh, hang on, when is the actual election? Is it June? May, right. So it's before the EU referendum. And we might find ourselves facing the independence question much more quickly than we expected after the EU referendum. It might suddenly come out of nowhere. That's back in the agenda, and obviously we have to have our arguments ready. So those were my thoughts on the first session. The second session, which was about the EU, holy shit, man. I went in as an undecided with a small U and came out as an undecided with a large U. I mean, every time somebody on that panel spoke, I was like, aye. And then somebody else spoke and I was like, aye. It's very, very difficult, I think, as a socialist to know exactly what the right move is here. That's why we're debating it in the way that we are. And I certainly think there are very strong arguments for leaving. I found myself quite convinced by a lot of those arguments and by the counter-arguments. I mean, if I can, I don't want to speak for the people who were on that panel, but if I can summarise certainly what I took from them, the EU is a capitalist superstructure. It always has been, it always will be. It's unreformable. It can crush local democracy. It can install austerity conditions, whether the people like it or not, end of, right? Let's get out. On the other hand, Alan Armstrong's position that the EU has the framework and the mechanism and the infrastructure to accommodate a European-wide uprising of people that can use that as a strong ballast against global capitalism. That can't be done by Scotland on its own, it can't be done by Britain on its own. The only available mechanism to us is European integration. And that is also, I think, a very strong argument. But the one thing that I think makes me sway towards staying in, and I'm not convinced, is the rise of British nationalism. That's one of the negative factors of the referendum. We talk a great deal about the positive factors of the referendum, but the no vote, there's a lot of people whose Britishness hardened during that time, and they've become politicised, and they're starting to become organised in the way that we became organised. And the point was made earlier on about the aftermath of the referendum, the day after the no vote. Had the unionist left position been the case, that, you know, the yes vote will divide working people and working class folk, there'll be barriers between them, and it's against solidarity, we would have seen mass demonstrations of working class people in the street celebrating solidarity and socialism. That didn't happen. What we saw was fascism. And the no vote gave British nationalism in Scotland momentum, justification, a democratic mandate. And I think that leaving the EU would augment that. That the narrative that the right has created, primarily around immigration, the no vote in the referendum and a leave vote in the EU, those two things would be consolidated into further momentum for British nationalists. Now, to be quite honest, where I would sometimes depart in this debate is I think there's often a knee-jerk anti-Rangersness that we can sometimes see in the Scottish left, and I'm not going to get too far into that, right, obviously. Because I know people who are Rangers supporters, and that's very, very much part of the identity, but but they're sympathetic to socialist ideas. They might have voted yes. They see Rangers getting attacked in certain websites and they just shut down. And that's unfortunate, but that's how it is. But that's not the same as criticising British nationalism. The left ceded British nationalism a long time ago because they were afraid of talking and acting as nationalists and as xenophobes. And the right have harnessed that energy, and they've done it in Scotland as well. So what we'll probably see in terms of electoral politics is Labour essentially dissolving, because they're now caught in a trap of their own making. They know that in order to get elected again, they have to start appealing to the very people who lost them and voted yes, and they're not getting those people back, to be quite honest. So they have to project that face, but by doing so, they lose their core support of unionists, who are the people who've been clinging to Labour because they see them as the bulwark of unionism in Scotland. And the Tories have taken advantage of that. The Tories have taken advantage of Labour's indecision to say, well, we are unequivocally unionist. We will always stand for the union. We will stand in the way of the SNP, and we're now starting to see that hardcore unionist support going towards the Tories and UKIP. And the landscape pretty soon in Scotland in terms of Holyrood is going to look like the SNP versus the Conservatives. Now that, as far as I'm concerned, is the class struggle in disguise. And after a successful no vote, the clothes will come off and we'll see that for what it is. So that's, sometimes you don't know what you think until somebody asks you to speak about it, to be honest. That's one of the reasons why I wanted to talk here today. The third panel that I was watching was the media debate. Really fascinating. Obviously, the media is something that comes up time and time again because it essentially sold a pro-union narrative during the referendum because newspapers were setting the broadcast agenda, and there it goes. There's no really, as far as I'm concerned, that much we can do about that except still have things like this. We need these on a regular basis so we can all talk to each other, still feel engaged, still feel motivated, still feel that the movement beyond the SNP has traction and presence. And the time will come fairly soon, I think, when we'll all be back in it again. And suddenly that word yes will have that same sort of power that it did in 2014. We're ready, we're on the way. You know, I don't think we've got any reason to be despondent. Every time I come to one of these things, I always leave really energised and engaged. So thank you very much for having me here today.